Jesus Christ is your only hope. It's not your religion. It's not your spirituality. It's certainly not your family or your money or your social standing. It's not works. It's not physical comfort. It's not Obi-Wan Kenobi. Help us, O Lord, for you are our only hope. The kind of worship song that Psalm 62 is the kind that is crying out from the cave that might as well be a grave. I don't know if you remember, if you've seen the movie Walk the Line, the biopic of Johnny Cash, and the moment when he and his pitiful band auditioned for the first time for Sun Records before producer Sam Phillips, and they sing some little hymns, and Sam Phillips says to them, "What would you sing if you were lying in a ditch left for dead?" Sing that song. Well, that's what Psalm 62 is. It is the song that comes out of the ditch. Psalm 62, I am at rest in God alone. My salvation comes from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my stronghold. I will never be shaken. How long will you threaten a man? Will all of you attack as if he were a leaning wall or a tottering fence? They only plan to bring him down from his high position. They take pleasure in lying. They bless with their mouths, but they curse inwardly. Selah. Rest in God alone, my soul, for my hope comes from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my stronghold. I will not be shaken. My salvation and glory depend on God, my strong rock. My refuge is in God. Trust in him at all times, you people. Pour out your hearts before him. God is our refuge. Selah. Common people are only a vapor. Important people, an illusion. Together on a scale, they weigh less than a vapor. Place no trust in oppression or false hope in robbery. If wealth increases, don't set your heart on it. God has spoken once. I have heard this twice. Strength belongs to God, and faithful love belongs to you, Lord. For you repay each according to his works. This is the word of the Lord. Heavenly Father, we thank you for it. Sir, we wish to see Jesus. And it's in his great name that we pray this request. Amen. Now, the specific circumstance that is giving rise to this psalm from the ditch, it's attributed to David. We don't know what that specific circumstance could be. It's very similar, of course, to some other Davidic psalms. There are any number of incidents in David's life that might have inspired this. It is listed also as a psalm according to Jeduthun, which is somewhat of a mysterious inscription as well. According to 2 Chronicles chapter 5, verse 12, the person, Jeduthun, is a Levitical singer. He's apparently bestowed with some sort of prophetic mantle. This is only one of 3 psalms directed to him. The others are Psalm 39 and Psalm 77. Scholars are somewhat divided over whether the instructions referring to Jeduthun are referring to him proper as a person, or sort of the family or guild of musicians in his name, or even a particular style of music that is in the Jeduthun vein, sort of like saying, this is in the style of Chris Tomlin, or Shane and Shane, right? In any event, we've lost the tune. We don't know what the tune is, of course, but the spirit of this song is daily relevant for the Christian life. Psalm 62 is traditionally categorized as one of the psalms of faith, or songs of trust or confidence, though it is very similar in structure to the psalms that are categorized as songs of lament. And in that regard, it's a very special song because it echoes the desperation of the human predicament, and at the same time, the refuge of divine reality, the reality that you cannot see, that is in fact more real than the reality that you can see. So you will note throughout the song that it's not the idea of God that is a refuge. It's not the theory of God or the notion of God that is a fortress. It is God himself. The Father's boundless love, his faithful love, made manifest, we know, looking through the lens of the new covenant, in the Son's atoning work applied by the Spirit's almighty power. You do not find an unshakable security in anything but Christ. Those of you who study, those of you in seminary, you do not find an unshakable security in academia, but in Adonai. And while this relatively short psalm is incredibly rich, there are at least three facets of the divine hope that gleam extra beautifully before us. I want to share those with you. Three ways in which the Old Covenant worship song shows us Christ as the grounds of our hope. The first is this: Christ is your only hope for rest. Christ is your only hope for rest. It begins right in the midst of the need for quiet, for comfort, for refuge. Verse 1, I am at rest in God alone. My salvation comes from Him. Now, the first phrase of the introduction to the song's refrain, I am at rest in God alone, has the connotation actually of a kind of silence. In fact, the ESV says, for God alone, my soul waits in silence. And it's a very sweet verse. It seems pleasant enough, but the entire tone of the psalm gives us a starker image of what this silence actually is. Don't picture, for instance, as you read verse 1, do not picture your morning devotion on the sun porch. I know you have a sun porch. It's okay. Don't be ashamed of it. Your morning devotion on the sun porch with the dog snoozing at your feet and your journaling Bible open on your quilt-covered lap, right? Andrew Peterson playing softly in the background. No, picture this instead. Picture that a storm has just torn through your neighborhood and it has ripped the roof off of part of your house, and wood and insulation and drywall are hanging by threads around the frames of what used to be your living room, and everything inside has been swept away by wind or soaked in rain, and the sky is still gray, and that feeling of hopelessness rises up in your chest, and you stand in your yard looking at the wreckage with dumbfounded eyes, and the whole street is eerily quiet. I am at rest in God alone. My rest isn't here. This rest, this silence is not the quiet of sweet devotion. It is the quiet after a raging storm. It is the disciples battered and bruised in that boat, rain-soaked hair matted against their forehead, and tear-stained cheeks that are pale with fright, staring at the master who has just quieted the entire wind and sea with a word, and they're thinking, we have no idea what just happened, but we know this man controls everything. Michael Wilcox says that we can say the truths found in this song at any time, really, but Psalm 62 is really for when bitter experience makes us mean them. Where do you go when the storm, whether it's a literal storm or more likely a metaphorical storm, has left behind a smoking crater in your life? Where do you go when just the daily accumulation of stresses and fears and slights and failures begin to pile up over your head, threatening to crash down on top of you? David spent a fair amount of time in caves, in holes, in dank caverns, on the hunt and on the run. And so I picture him laying awake at night, surrounded by stony walls, all knots and crags, and surrounded in darkness, perhaps illuminated only slightly by a dying fire. And he's staring at the rocky ceiling above him, and his back and his head are aching from the rock underneath him. And these lines come from the depth of his aching heart to the tremble of his parched lips. He alone is my rock. He alone is my salvation, my stronghold. I will never be shaken. And even as he shivers against the cold, and he fears for his very life, he says, in God I will never be shaken. Now, what is he facing in particular? What does he need the rest of the Lord from? It would appear, at least his initial focus is on some kind of outside attack, right? Verse 3, how long will you threaten a man? Will all of you attack as if he were a leaning wall or a tottering fence? They only plan to bring him down from his high position. They take pleasure in lying. They bless with their mouths, but they curse inwardly. The psalmist is essentially saying, they're trying to bring me down. I'm already weak, like a wall leaning over or a tottering fence, and they're coming to take advantage of me in my weakness. They see their opportunity to hit me while I'm already bent low. I can't even get my head up from the previous strikes, and they come to rain more blows upon me. There are liars, there are hypocrites, they bless with their mouths, and they curse in private behind closed doors. There are schemers, and there are plotters. The reference to bringing one down from a high position in verse 4 may refer to a kind of jealousy-driven or otherwise malicious, intentional usurping of authority. Or it could just be the unintended effect of a long-suffering work among disobedient people. Pastor, do you feel that? I hear almost weekly from pastors who could easily identify with what has just been read in Psalm 62. They feel targeted, picked on, and like it's just one thing after another, and you can't get your head above water. There's a lot of people in this room. There are undoubtedly some of you who feel this psalm at this particular moment more keenly than others, but I suspect there's a great number of ministers who even now are thinking of the world waiting for them back home, whether you live 5 miles away or 5 states away. And you fear when you get back, you'll just have another set of anonymous letters in your mailbox, or another anonymous note slipped under your door, another angry voice in your inbox, another apologetic soul reporting that yet another family is planning to leave, and you begin to picture the domino effect. If this family leaves and that family leaves, and you begin to see the budgetary constraints that are exacerbated by just one more exit, or if just one more leader quits on you, and you're tired of preaching every week, not only to people who don't care or don't apply or don't even stay awake, but to people who are weakly stabbing you in the back. That one lady 2/3 of the way back on the left-hand side who stares you down while you preach with her arms crossed and a scowl on her face. And if that sounded really specific, there's a reason for that. And when this conference is over, going back to your normal life, where normal for you is just one pain or stressor after another. And there are influential people in your church, perhaps, who are against you. And there are timid people in your church who won't stand up for you. And the quitting and the laziness and even the insults and the gossip seem contagious. It just begins to infect and spread. Where do you go? What do you do? The psalmist returns right back to the refrain. In an echo of verses 1 and 2, look at verses 5 and 6. Rest in God alone, my soul, for my hope comes from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my stronghold. I will not be shaken. And when it seems they've doubled the attack, he doubles the refrain, verses 7 and 8. He extends it. My salvation and glory depend on God, my strong rock. My refuge is in God. Trust in him at all times, you people. Pour out your hearts before him. God is our refuge. The psalmist expands the refrain. Why? Because though our trouble comes in ever-doubling doses, the grace of God is greater still. And so the quiet soul of verses 1 and 5 is not found in the quiet of one's circumstances, but through the chaos of life in the comfort of Christ. Pastor, where do you go for comfort? When you feel afflicted, when you feel opposed, when you feel undermined, when you feel attacked, do you go to distractions? Do you go to food? Do you go to entertainment, sports, social media? Do you go to Netflix? Do you go to pornography? Do you go to drugs or alcohol? Do you just go into the reservoir of your own wherewithal, right? The broken cisterns of worldly advice or religious busy work? Do you try to medicate your malaise with more and more pastoring? You think redoubling your efforts will fix it? Well, picture getting back home, pulling back into the church parking lot, all of those pressures and pains begin rebounding back to you, and you've come to expect just one more thing every time you check in and you walk through that door and you hear, there's a visitor in your office, and your heart just sinks. What in the world can it be this time? And you take a deep breath, and you open the door, steeling yourself for what lays behind in your study. And as you open the door, you see there's Jesus sitting in your chair behind your desk. And he says, come on in, take a seat. And you look down at the chair facing your desk, the chair people sit in when they come for counseling from you, or comfort from you, or answers from you, or blood from you. And you sit slowly down, and you can barely look at his face. Because what must he think of you in your sorry attempt at ministry? And Jesus says, all right, tell me all about it. And you say, I don't even know where to begin. And Jesus says, I have all the time in the world. And so you just start spilling your guts. Every single fear, every single hurt, every single wound, every single worry, every single sin. And it all spills out of you, and it just seems to pile up invisibly on the floor. And when you think you've got it all out, every last weighty concern, you feel out of words, but you just sputter out, I just feel completely overwhelmed, and I don't know what to do. And Jesus looks at you with the warmest gaze that you have ever seen, and he says, well, yeah, of course. Because brothers, you run smack into the greatest privilege any of us could ever enjoy, which is this: we come to the end of ourselves and find there the sufficiency of Christ. It's at the end of one's rope that we find that Christ is more than enough. And I have come to believe that for a great many of us, if not for all of us, Christ will not become our only hope until he is our only hope. Until we've run dry and out of options and out of crutches and out of props. Until we're leaning and tottering, bent low and beat down. When you're in the ditch and your body is screaming, but your soul is quiet in the foreboding aftermath of a great personal cataclysm, there is Christ, mighty to save. No one is your rock but he. No one is your stronghold but he. Rest in him alone. John Calvin on this passage, he says the silence, the rest of soul hinted at in verse 1 and verse 5 is the kind of peace that is the meek and submissive endurance of the cross. Brothers and sisters, he knows what it's like. He knows what it's like. And thus only Christ can be your true hope in these moments. He did not say, come to me all who need self-improvement and I will give you steps. He says, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden. I will give you rest. But sometimes it's not the attacks from the outside that threaten our peace, that threaten to embed in us a sense of hopelessness, is it? Sometimes it's something less obvious, something harder to quantify. Sometimes it's not an issue of attack that threatens our peace, but an issue of appraisal. Thus, Christ is your only hope for rest, but secondly, Christ is your only hope for validation. Christ is your only hope for validation. I am not sure if I've ever met a vocational group more insecure than that of pastors, who ought to be the most secure because they deal in the gospel. They claim to be servants of the call of God, and yet they measure themselves constantly according to their popularity among sinners. And their churches are very often willing to help them with those comparisons. Here comes the fellow after service who wants to point out Matt Chandler preached that text a different way. Right? Or I was listening to an Ask Pastor John, and John Piper, he gave a different answer to that question. And you want to say, I would be glad to transfer your letter to Matt Chandler's church if you would like to go. John Piper retired because he was tired of listening to people like you, right? No. But you don't say it, do you? You think it. You don't say it because you're nice. You just say thanks. And you go home and you hate the guy in your heart, don't you? Or maybe you just feel nitpicked and second-guessed. A lot of times it's just the internal mess that is you. It's not really even anything somebody's saying or doing. It's just your own insecurity, your anxiety, your sense of inadequacy, the way that you're over self-conscious but under self-aware, the way that you're constantly measuring yourself against the guy across the street or the guy on the podcast or the you that you want to be or the you used to be. and you fail to see that there is no lasting validation to be found in becoming a better version of you because the goalposts are always moving. The finish line of assurance is always out of reach. You're making the wrong comparison. You compare yourself to the gifts of others and feel unnecessarily bad, or you compare yourself to the weaknesses of others and you feel artificially good. The psalmist writes in verse 10, place no trust in oppression or false hope in robbery. If wealth increases, don't set your heart on it. Now, these specific circumstances are representative of a kind of gain and loss, of victory and failure. You don't have to be into physical oppression or literal robbery to fall into the indictment of verse 10, by the way. You can simply see your fellow workers as competition, as rivals for the glory that you want, and be just as guilty of oppression or robbery in the heart because you rob them of their dignity or just of the affection that's due them as fellow image bearers. The central emphasis is on unjust or unseemly gain. Are you poaching sheep from other churches? Say, no, of course not. But maybe you're just allowing them to wander into your flock and you're looking the other way, telling yourself it's the other guy just doesn't have the gifts that you have. They're lucky to be in your sheep pen. They deserve a better pastor like you. Or for whatever reason, you're placing your trust in any kind of increase, whether it's money or reputation, attendance or influence. And the psalmist is clear at the end of verse 10, even when blessings come your way, don't set your heart on them. Now, verses 9 and 10 together are, in fact, an expose of the hollowness of man's pursuit apart from the security of God, apart from the solidity of God's purposes. Verse 9 is especially helpful in a very devastating and revelatory way, isn't it? Common people are only a vapor, important people, an illusion. Together on a scale, they weigh less than a vapor. And I don't know about the math, but you have a vapor and an illusion, and you put them together, they weigh less than a vapor. How does that make sense? In any event, I love the specificity here because the psalmist could have easily said, as the scriptures say elsewhere, quite simply, man is a vapor. And if it were to say that, it would certainly be true, and that is the collective truth of the distinct truths in verse 9, but we could easily turn man, generalized, is a vapor, into a vague means of discounting others. Instead, nobody is left off the hook. The quote-unquote important people, by which I assume it means people with some kind of social currency, whether it's financial or just influence, the people on top, the important people, they cannot simply treat common people like vapor because they're an illusion themselves. Your importance doesn't buy you any more worth or dignity. And at the same time, the common people, this is really interesting, the common people cannot write off the so-called important people. Everyone is indicted here. No one can wield one's social currency, whether it's found in being among the common man or being among the social elite, against the other. Together, compared to the immensity and eternality and security of God, we're all just smoke. There's Jeff Bezos. Elon Musk, right there. Bill Gates, Donald Trump. There's the megachurch pastor. Here's you. Your spouse. Your children. You could put all of mankind together on a scale, the psalmist is essentially saying, and the sum is less than the totality of the pieces. The lesson appears to be that the more you try to accumulate or achieve or accomplish or to find your satisfaction in, to find your validation in, the less satisfied and validated you actually end up. You're not going to find it in big churches or small churches, in famous platforms or proud obscurity. There's nothing about the urban center or the rural area that makes you any better than anybody else. Anything you set your heart on that isn't Christ is going to let you down. Set your heart on Christ. In 1805, the Congregationalist pastor Lemuel Haynes discovered that a Universalist preacher by the name of Hosea Ballou was coming to preach in his pulpit. The association essentially did pulpit supply. If someone was absent, they would assign another preacher to come speak in the pulpit. And so for whatever reason, Haynes didn't know that it was this particular fellow coming to preach in his pulpit. He had another speaking engagement, which he aimed to keep his own commitment, as distressed as he was that a Universalist would be preaching from his pulpit. Those who had invited him canceled their invitation for his sake, that he might return to his church in the West Rutland parish of Vermont and be present when Hosea Ballou preached from his pulpit. And by all indications, Lemuel Haynes just sat in the congregation. Hosea Ballou preached on universalism from the pulpit, and when he was done, he asked Pastor Haynes if he would like to say any words in response. And at first, Lemuel Haynes demurred, said, no, that's fine. Hosea Ballou got a little cocky. Like, yeah, I shut you down. You don't have an answer for what I have just preached and presented. To which Haynes said, well, perhaps I shall say a few words. And he came to the pulpit, and as far as we know from the historical record, extemporaneously, Lemuel Haynes preached a message that was later titled, when he went back to write down what he had preached, a message called Universalism, an Ancient Doctrine, which is a very cheeky title. Essentially, he says universalism is a very ancient doctrine. It goes all the way back to antiquity of Genesis chapter 3, verse 4, where the serpent says, you shall not surely die. That doctrine comes straight from the mouth of the devil himself. That's how old it is. What ensued after that was somewhat of a media spat, right? The social media back and forth, there's nothing new under the sun. These two fellows, Hosea Ballou and Lemuel Haynes, exchanged public addresses against each other, debating each other over the course of, public addresses, but also letters published in the newspaper and different religious magazines. Back and forth, back and forth. Haynes suffered many rhetorical blows in these exchanges. Others began to weigh in, and as so often happens online, right, it got increasingly personal. People take sides. They begin to chime in. It began to expose some of the racist underbelly that polite society had kind of pretended wasn't there. Haynes, who was African American, began to suffer racist insults. One particular theological critic said his heart is as black as his skin. And as the heat in the debate increased, Haynes held the line for Christian orthodoxy and the matter of heaven and hell and the gospel, arguing consistently for the exclusivity of Christ for salvation and the peril of not explicitly repenting and believing in him. At one point, Ballou lamented that in the fray, Haynes had been too personal, that he had sullied his reputation among churchgoers, as if preaching universalism shouldn't do that on its own. And in response to this claim of hurt feelings, Haynes replied, addressing the notion of reputation and feelings. And this is from one of his letters to Hosea Ballou. He says, many of your hearers had a very different idea of your performance than what you represent in your letter. You proceed further to extol the discourse that here was nothing corrosive against any name or denomination of professors. Let me here observe that, had you treated my name or the names of any other denomination of men with contempt and let another name alone, you would never have heard from me. But sir, let me tell you, there is a name which is above every name. This is a name in comparison of which your name and my name are of little worth. This name is Jesus, the living Christ. If I am not mistaken, this name was treated by you with utmost contempt, and so were those who have a real veneration for it. Pastor, are you more worried about your name than that of Jesus Christ? More worried about your reputation than his? Let us all, like Lemuel Haynes, say, it's not my name or your name that counts the most. The real offense that should be taken is that we do disservice to the name above all names. Let us all, like John the Baptist, feel our vaporous capacity compared to the risen glory of the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the Lord of all creation, Jesus Christ. Pastors wither and ministries fade, but the name of the Lord endures forever. And I have to tell you that you will never, ever experience the validation that you ultimately seek until the name of Christ becomes more precious to you than your own name. Christ is your only hope for rest. Christ is your only hope for validation. And thirdly and finally, Christ is your only hope for righteousness. Christ is your only hope for righteousness. We come to the end of the song now, and it is a quite remarkable crescendo. There is an augmented version now of the refrain that's found in verses 1 and 2 and verses 5 through 8. Here in verses 11 and 12, we find out the inner workings of the stronghold of God. Why is God a strong refuge? Why is he a strong rock? Why is he the only one in which we can take real security? Verse 11, God has spoken once, I have heard this twice. Strength belongs to God, and faithful love belongs to you, Lord. For you repay each according to his works. Now, verse 11 is rather confusing. God spoke once, I heard twice. It's a kind of echo, perhaps, right? Some exegetes have seen a kind of metaphorical formula for the gospel here. God speaks once, and the hearing twice is a reference to law and gospel. I think that's somewhat unlikely. Spurgeon says God does not need to speak twice. He utters one word with final authority, and yet it resounds in our ear, and that is what hearing twice refers to. We should, he says, let the final word of God echo in our minds over and over again. That's likely more true. For my part, I simply think this is a poetic emphasis, similar to what we see in other places in Scripture. In particular, Amos chapter 1, verse 3. I will not relent from punishing Damascus for 3 crimes, even 4. Well, which is it? Is it 3 or 4? I just told you, for 3 and also for 4, okay? Proverbs chapter 6, verse 16. The Lord hates 6 things. Oh, in fact, 7 are detestable to him. You have to understand this is Spirit-inspired language, so it must mean something. It can't mean that the Spirit's not sure. If he hates 6 things or 7 things, the point isn't the math, it's the emphasis. It's a poetic language. It's a poetic way of stressing the point, of essentially saying, this is really important. I'm putting an exclamation point on this. What is important? Strength belongs to God, and faithful love belongs to the Lord. And this has to be held in supreme importance before we get to the final line, or we will end up with a weak theology at best or a damning theology at worst. For you repay each according to his works. I want to stress that verse 12 should be intimidating to you, not comforting. If you read verse 12's final line and think it speaks to the reward for your moral virtue, you are on very thin ice. In fact, we need only look to this, the way this song is referenced in the New Testament to help us in our understanding. In Romans chapter 2, Paul quotes Psalm 62, verse 12, as part of his proclamation of the wrath of God coming for those outside of Christ. So verse 12b is essentially a warning. Verse 12a is the promise of the gospel. What the psalmist is saying is this: there's no hope in yourself. Your only hope is Christ alone, his faithful love. His strength. That's what you need. I do a fair amount of traveling, and as I travel, I try to take every advantage as I can. I enjoy the comforts of life. One of those advantages that I've discovered is quite a blessing to me is TSA PreCheck. Anybody else TSA PreCheck? Wonderful. What I've discovered is some people get TSA PreCheck who do not go through the TSA PreCheck instructions or requirements. Right? So I discovered this as people began to travel with me. For me to get TSA PreCheck, this is what you do. You go down to a little office, you fill out an application, they do this big background check, you fill out this lengthy interview questions, you pay a certain amount of money for this privilege. Dr. Allen, my background check came back clean. I don't know about you. I'm sorry. I just want to tell you, no terror watch list here. They said, you qualify. You pass the test, you pass the inspection, your check cleared, you have TSA PreCheck. So then I take my family with me when I travel, or one of the ministry residents from Liberty Baptist Church. And what I discovered is if they're on my itinerary that I booked, they get the TSA PreCheck. And at first I was a little miffed by this because they didn't go subject themselves to an interview. There's no background check on them. They didn't pay any money, they didn't chip in anything. They get to sail through security based on the imputed righteousness of my TSA pre-check. You see? You know where I'm going with this. They did nothing but attach their name to my name. And then what is mine becomes theirs. Similarly, brothers and sisters, you and I do not pass the check. The look into your background turns up things you didn't even know about. You are not as good a repenter as you think you are. And the amount of money that it would cost, you will never have in a million lifetimes. And yet here comes Christ the Lord, who owes us nothing and covers us with everything. He pays the price. He exposes himself to all of the hatred, all of the inspection, all of the scrutiny, that his righteousness might become ours. By our works? No, by simply saying, I want my name to be hidden in your name. That what is yours becomes mine. In fact, the shadow of the cross just looms over this entire psalm. It was Christ who was offered in the desert great wealth, the robbery of the Father's purpose for unseemly gain, and he refused to set his heart on that. It was indeed Christ who went silently, his soul entrusted to the Father as outsiders attacked him and tore his flesh and spit on his face. It was Christ bent low that they came closer to rain more blows upon him. Those who once blessed him with their mouths now begin to curse him. Those who claimed to support him turned away, abandoned him at the time of his greatest need. He had no earthly refuge. He sought no earthly comfort. He relinquished all of his divine privilege to be led like a silent lamb to the slaughter. And he took the nails and the thorns and the spear for you. And if you want to be repaid for the works that will prove a stronghold in the day of judgment, you best put on the works of Christ and no others. You must have his strength and not your own. The rock is not your righteousness. The refuge is not your rightness. The salvation is not your spirituality. The validation is not your ministry. In fact, if verse 12 referred to our works righteousness, it would undercut the entire psalm, which stresses to the soul in turmoil from without and within, hope in God alone. Christ is your only hope of righteousness. And so, when the feeble scaffolding of your religious efforts and your passing ministries falls away, and the scales of verse 9 are carted out, and we go to be weighted, we will be found wanting. May we be found claiming only Christ, only Christ, only Christ. Not simply for my forgiveness, Lord, but also for my righteousness. Cleanse the slate and inscribe on it the perfect obedience of your Son. Put me in the wedding garment of your own works, for mine are filthy rags. Brothers and sisters, turn out your pockets, offer him nothing but your need, and he will give you the riches of the righteousness of himself. And when you find yourself in that darkened cave, in the quiet after the storm, it may be right now, it might be tomorrow, maybe it's the end of your days. Let us sing in the spirit of Psalm 62 at all times. Let us sing words like, Rock of ages, cleft for me. Let me hide myself in thee. Let the water and the blood from thy wounded side which flowed be of sin the double cure, save from wrath and make me pure. Sing it with me. Not the labors of my hands can fulfill thy law's commands. Could my zeal no respite know? Could my tears forever flow? All for sin could not atone. Thou must save, and thou alone. Won't you stand with me? Nothing in my hand I bring, simply to thy cross I cling. Naked come, helpless look, foul I to the fountain fly. Wash me, Savior, or I die. While I draw